Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Danny Smith, and I'm the Manager of Events and Marketing at Microexcel. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Power of Microsoft Flow with CRM, SharePoint, and Project, as we highlight the many capabilities of Microsoft Flow. Presenting today is Jonathan Adams, Microexcel's Managed Services Team Lead. John comes to us with over 10 years of experience in the Microsoft technology stack. When he is not pontificating on SharePoint or trying to break Office 365, he likes to write awkward introduction sentences for people to read during public presentations. Just a few laundry items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out in a few days. Also, we will have a Q&A portion at the end, so please type any questions you may have in the questions box, and we will get to those in the order they are received. If you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to contact us at info@microexcel.com. At the conclusion of today's webinar, there will be a brief survey. Please do take a few moments and share your thoughts with us. So without further ado, I'd like to present our speaker for today's event, Mr. John Adams.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. So, as was mentioned, I'm a senior SharePoint consultant as well as managed services team lead with Microexcel. I'm an MCSA and a part-time blogger and even more part-time amateur Pokemon trainer. After this presentation, if you have any other questions, you want to reach out, just comment down how cool my hat is in the picture. Feel free to reach out to me at my email, my blog of SeriousSharePoint.com, and my Twitter at SeriousPoint. So I also mentioned I'm a consultant at Microexcel. No, Microexcel is a Microsoft Gold partner. That's a cloud solutions provider for Microsoft, and one of the largest small companies I know. So we have locations all over the world, handling everything from the Microsoft stack to SAP to QA. And essentially, if there's a project you can think of that you need help with, there's odds are we can help you, or we can at least point you in the right direction. But what we're all here for today is to talk about the power of Microsoft Flow. Now, you would think I'm going to start off by talking about Microsoft Flow, but I like to keep you on your toes. So I'm going to tell you a story instead. So I'd like you to meet a company, all right, down-to-earth modern organics. All right, they were founded last year, but they're already the world's leading fictional distributor of organic goods. Now, there's 3 core pieces of technology they use, and it's all Office 365, luckily enough. It's Dynamics 365, SharePoint Online, and Project Online. But despite having the best of the technology out there right now, they have issues with a slow customer acquisition process. The pipeline just is not going fast, and they need to figure out why, and they need to fix it. So let's take a quick look at the technologies that they're actually using today. Dynamics 365. Now, this is a relatively new, but it's also old at the same time. If you're familiar with Dynamics, your Dynamics CRM, Dynamics AX, Dynamics for Operations, the new Dynamics for Financials, those are all essentially different flavors and incorporated into Dynamics 365, even though they might have different SKUs depending on what solutions you're looking for. But so this is the 365, the online hosted offering, and it's also part of Office 365. As you can see, it's seamlessly integrated into the rest of Office to some extent, and we'll go into more of that later. And then we have everybody's favorite, SharePoint Online, the document management that can do a heck of a lot more with workflow, process automation, its own workflow engine, which, by the way, Dynamics 365 also has a separate workflow engine, as well as, of course, being a top-notch enterprise collaboration platform. And finally, for the nitty-gritty, we have Project Online, the power of the project scheduling, resource management, budget planning, all of that fantastic tool set right there up in the cloud. So they have these 3 tools available. They're using them. What's going wrong? Well, let's take a quick look at the process. The client acquisition process starts with the sales team. Okay, they need to identify an opportunity, and they enter it into their Dynamics 365, into their CRM solution. Their goal here is to track the information, create a proposal, work with the potential account, close the account. All of their day-to-day business is done here in Dynamics 365. They don't need to go to SharePoint Online. They don't really have a concern about SharePoint Online. They're more efficient and they're more familiar with the tool when they're in Dynamics. But as part of their process, when they create a proposal after entering an opportunity, they have to currently email that over to pre-sales to have them evaluate and complete the proposal. But here's the problem. Pre-sales doesn't work in CRM. Day-to-day, the pre-sales team likes to work in SharePoint Online. They like the more free-form collaboration, the open tool set, and just overall, it's how they've conducted and arranged their business processes. So this proposal that's been drafted by the sales team is emailed over to pre-sales, who then takes it and uploads it into their SharePoint site, manually enters the appropriate metadata for it, reviews the proposal, updates the proposal, and when it's finally ready, they mark it as reviewed in their system, but then they have to email it back to the sales associate. And then we're back in sales. Sales doesn't work in SharePoint. Sales likes to work in Dynamics. So that same file is now being uploaded into Dynamics 365 again. And that's the version of the file that's being worked with by the manager and the client. And after that version is reviewed and signed off and approved, then a final copy is sent over to pre-sales, again via email, to give them a heads up. And then an email with the document is sent over to the project manager. Now, the project manager doesn't work in CRM. They don't work in SharePoint. They like to use Project Online. That's where they do their everyday business. So the signed proposal that's been reviewed and sent to him, he now has to review again, go through it, create an appropriate Project Online site, because there's no automation for that right now, and then he has to go and populate that site with tasks and milestones from the proposal. So he's basically cutting and pasting to put that item into his system. Now, you can tell just from walking through this, if you even stayed awake, how tedious and how much of a waste of a time essentially this process is. You have, every time you hear manual, every time you hear email, that's another potential point of failure. That's a potential point of someone not seeing the email, of someone being out and wasting another week before their part of the pipeline is modified. It's, in general, a lot of bottlenecks and a lot of rooms for misinformation and poor data entry. So if we go through the screens quickly, again, this will be very quick because we just want to kind of walk through what they're experiencing. Here's Dynamics 365 and the opportunity. As a salesperson, I care about the data here. But when it comes over to pre-sales, even though SharePoint is simple enough, it's not I might not have access. Because the pre-sales team might want to work independently. And B, it's just another site to click through. And it may sound trivial, but these inconveniences add up and can lead to larger overall process and time issues. So pre-sales, when they get the file, they upload it to their site because they know where it belongs. They know what has to be entered in terms of metadata for it. And they know the workflows and the process that starts off of that document when it's uploaded, because that's where they do their work. And then finally, when it goes back to sales, sales has to take that document, upload it back into CRM, and then at the end of it all, email goes out and project manager now has to go ahead and update the project online. So we know the problem. The problem is there's a lot of manual back and forth, a lot of bottlenecks. But the other problem is there's 3 different environments, and they're tailored for the specific teams that use them. We don't want to necessarily make these teams suddenly change their entire process. We can't say it's better. One tool isn't necessarily better than the other for what that group does. We can see here also that when we look at each of those individual solutions, they have they all have their own workflow. You know, there's SharePoint workflow for SharePoint Online and Project Online. There's Dynamics 365 workflow for Dynamics 365. There's also integration with groups in all three. So you may be thinking, okay, they all have their own workflow solution. They all talk to groups. Why is it so hard to get this data passed back and forth? Well, it comes down to permissions and the way that the different applications are using those groups. Dynamics 365, when they create an opportunity, they might be creating a new group, but that doesn't necessarily mean that suddenly all the necessary pre-sales people have access to it. Furthermore, when you talk about the workflow components, those workflow engines in each of those individual applications are fantastic for manipulating data within the specific application. But the moment you try and talk and pass data outside of it, then you're starting to look at more problems. You're looking at, do I take advantage of REST APIs? There's a proper type of connector there. If not, what middle point do I need to go through? The workflows are meant to work superbly within the individual applications. So this is where Microsoft Flow comes in. Microsoft Flow is the glue between different applications and different services. And while you might think of that previous scenario about, okay, well, they're all in groups, I'm sure I could, work something out where we go through groups as a middle layer. Yes, you might be able to, but Flow isn't locked into Microsoft. Flow is open to a whole bunch of different services and systems that can be tied into it, and that lets you flow and break out of actually Flow, yeah, of course, break out of that Microsoft Office 365 ecosystem and start looking at all of your applications and how you can exchange data through all of them, not just the Office 365 suite. So some other advantages of Flow are it's its own service. If you think of it just from a process perspective, you don't have change control for every time you change a flow. You don't have to worry about change control for SharePoint, for Dynamics, for Project Online, because those systems are staying untouched. The workflow is its own entity. So if you're making a change to the workflow through Microsoft Flow, you are not affecting those other three systems. Plus, it acts as that common interface for automation. You don't have to stress about the API. You don't have to worry about what patch or new feature is going to alter the API to version 2.4, maybe potentially altering how the data in the web service you use is handled. But at the same time, it's meant to act as glue. It's that to fill in the gaps. So while it could move some stuff around from that, like SharePoint to SharePoint, that's not where it excels. It is not going to replace that workflow for each of those individual services. But as I mentioned, it's neutral. It's not specific to just Microsoft. It can be used, it's not restricted to even organization, technology, environments. What matters are the elements of the individual flow, the connections, triggers, and actions, which I'll go into. So, like I mentioned, I just said connections, triggers, and actions. Those are actually the three building blocks that make up Microsoft Flow. Flow, in essence, is workflow kind of dumbed down, and it's meant to be simple. It's cause and effect. Something happens in service A, we check something or not, and then something else happens in service B. And we flow down this cause and effect type of chain. So one cause can have multiple effects. So the cause is called a trigger. So a trigger, just like you might imagine from any other application, something happens, that starts off the flow. Very standard, except, like I said, the flow is not part of that application. Instead, that external flow is being triggered by the internal event. And then we have what's called an action. An action is the effect. So while something can be the trigger and start the flow, the action is the event that the flow itself initiates. So we can say something in application A starts off a flow, that's your trigger, but then the flow kicks off action B, C, and D in a whole separate application or several different applications. Those actions are initiated by flow, and that's why they're called an action. So flow kicks off actions, triggers kick off the flow. Now we also have connections. Connections are what we are looking at and talking to for these triggers and actions. They're the service or application, and it's also the identity we are using when we communicate with that application. So again, using flow. Using flow gives us 3 distinct advantages over trying to use a workflow engine that's already baked into one of the separate applications. It's independent, again, so we can modify it, do whatever we want. We're not going to break anything. You can consider it almost like a black box model. Data comes out of application A, data is going to go into application B, but whatever happens there in the middle with your flow, it's not going to affect the core functioning of your application. It's also flexible because it's not tied down to Office 365. It's tied down to what you define as your connection. So if a service is available as a connection, regardless of where it's coming from, Google, MailChimp, Microsoft, it can be part of your flow. So you're breaking out of this technology-dependent restrictions. You don't have to worry about everything using the same protocol. You don't have to worry about trying to work around a separate API. And lastly, it's simple. It's meant to be simple. That's partly why it doesn't replace your individual workflows on the applications, but it's also because it's not meant to be, they don't want it to be complicated. It actually was first out as kind of a user-facing tool. And of course, that evolved into a team and enterprise tool. But the flows themselves are not meant to be complicated. They're meant to fill in the gaps and do simply, but very well, where the other workflow engines are having some trouble. So let's take a quick look here at an actual flow. So I've kind of skipped ahead a bit and just created a brand new flow for us to explore. What we see is connectors, triggers, and if there were any actions that are available. A common scenario is when something happens in SharePoint, let's go ahead and take a corresponding action, maybe save something off into OneDrive. So each of these connectors has its own set of actions and triggers. If here, for this example, I take SharePoint to take a look, the triggers are these events and files created, items created, and so on. But the actions it can take, the effects that you can have, are much greater. And that's usually the case. There will be a limited selection of events that will start off a flow, but you also have a much greater selection of what the flow can do to those separate applications. In this case, however, we want to work when a file is created. So very simple, create a block, let's just put in the site address, the folder. Now I'm not entering any actual information here because I just want to show the steps to create a flow. But from here, we can add an action, a condition, and if we want to get a little fancier, we can add some loops, switch, etc. Most of the time, and for most of what we need to do, a condition and an action is more than sufficient. So here we'll add a condition. And if we click in, what we take a look at is we see the values that are available from our trigger. So when the trigger happens, it's also making certain pieces of information available that we can then use to determine, do we want to continue with this action? Do we want to do something else? Typical condition items. So here I'm just going to go ahead and say if the file name does not end with, and let me close this, a Q, for whatever reason. If the file name does not end in Q, maybe it's some naming convention we have, then let's go ahead and do another action. So here though, I'm going to choose an action. I'm going to choose OneDrive. I want to do something else in a separate system, OneDrive for Business in this case, because something happened there in SharePoint. So when you select your connector, it searches for the actions at that point in time. Which can sometimes take a little bit. So I'll give it one more shot. Select OneDrive Business. And here we see all the triggers and actions that we need. Now, we're not going to worry about another trigger because we want to actually just get something done. So we're looking at our actions here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a corresponding file in OneDrive whenever a file is created in SharePoint. But you know what? I want to make it the exact same file. We can do that. As we click into the individual fields of the flow, we are prompted with the data from the initial application that had the trigger that we can use. And we'll see that as we cascade down between applications, that the data from one service can then be handed off and used in another. That's the very essence. And it's not necessarily stuck to be in linear fashion. If I use OneDrive here and then later down I decide to use MailChimp, SharePoint and OneDrive values can be used in that next MailChimp action. But in this case, because I want to create a brand new file that duplicates the original, I'm just going to insert the entire file content from the file that was created in SharePoint. In fact, I'm just going to copy all that information, the file name. But here in the path, we want to be careful because this is the local path for OneDrive. And so we'll just call this duplicates. And then when you're done, you click Save Flow. So that's the essence of a flow. It's that simple. You go, you create your blocks, yes or no. Of course, there's other fancier options available, which I'll show you as well. And then we click Save, and that workflow is then running. We haven't published it. We've just saved it, created the flow, and it's triggered as on or not. When you're looking at your flows, whether they're running or not is a matter of clicking a switch. You're not restricted to a publish, to worrying about files moving over. Because it's an independent service, everything, including turning it on or off, resides right here within Flow. So let's jump back to Modern Organic to see what we can do using Flow to help out down-to-earth Modern Organics. Excuse me. So now we're going to take a look at all those manual steps, all those emails, uploading, downloading. We're going to replace that with Flow, being that glue, and taking the manual steps away from the users, and we're going to use Flow instead to do it all reliably, dynamically, and much faster. So we have the same initial start, you know. The opportunity is entered into Office 365. Okay. But when the opportunity is created, we also are able to check as part of CRM. Let's go there now. As part of CRM, one of our data fields is develop a proposal. We are using this as a trigger. So when sales creates an opportunity for avocado skin cream in this case, which sounds delicious, we then say develop a proposal as well. And that triggers flow number one. What it does is flow number one here is listening for dynamic CRM. When it hears that, it actually uses what's called an advanced condition. Now, this advanced condition is actually based off of Azure workflow logic. So it's the same syntax. And as some of you might recognize, it's also very similar to some other workflow app that Azure has, because it's the same foundation. So this Azure workflow logic is actually doing a more in-depth conditional than the basic one I had showed before. But it's essentially saying when this develop proposal value is true, that's going to be your yes, otherwise no. And then we walk through, we get two different records from CRM, so we have the appropriate data. We get the file content from a proposal template. We create a list item with metadata, as well as a file with the actual file content data, and I'll get into why in a few minutes. We update the item after we create the file, so the item has a path link to the file, and then we send the final notification email. So you might be wondering, why are we creating a file? Why are we creating an item? As I mentioned, flow is simple, and as a result, sometimes it doesn't have everything you need. You are not going to be replacing your SharePoint workflow with flow. You are going to be enhancing it. You're going to be bringing in all these other pieces of information, all these other sources, but you're not going to replace it because there are limitations due to the design, the simplicity, and it's really not meant to replace those workflow solutions. So one of the restraints is when you're creating a file, well, it doesn't really let you enter that custom metadata you have, right? So how are you going to get it there? What about when you create an item? You can't include an attachment. That's a problem, right? So sometimes you have to do creative workarounds. One of those is creating an item, creating a file. They're separate. One has metadata, one has the file content. And then you update the item with the path to the file, and you let a SharePoint workflow make sure everything is updated. Again, because not everything will be able to be done, but you can get you quite a bit of the ways there. So that's step one in our process. That's our flow to replace the automatic, the manual rather, creation of a proposal document. And now you can actually take a look at the site. And so this is what we're looking for, the document residing in the pre-sales team site. And here we have additional metadata, but that's related to the next step. So we'll take a look at that. Okay, so pre-sales now has that document. Okay, now they can fill in the blanks, review it, and approve it, but they don't have to worry about sending it back to CRM. We don't want these agents to have to jump around to a bunch of different systems. We want them to work where they're comfortable, where they're efficient, and we don't want to worry about miscommunication, permissions, and all that other fun stuff. So since pre-sales already has a document, all they have to do is update the metadata, review it for accuracy. Once they review it, they can update the metadata manually on their end, mark that proposal as completed, and that will trigger a flow to get it back to CRM. So they don't have to worry about emailing the sales associate. They don't have to worry about knowing how the CRM system works. All they have to do is mark it as complete. As you can see here, it says proposal ready. When it's not ready, it's no. In this case, it's been marked to yes. So let's take a look at that flow. So when, open this up. So what happens is when a new item is added, and this is actually part of the previous step, it creates a task, and that's how we're actually notifying the sales team, the pre-sales team rather. So this task is actually being sent and being used to track whether the SharePoint document is ready. Instead of reading the metadata and taking action on that, we're actually acting off of a separate task that's being used so that a manual action of is it ready or not is being taken. So with this task, when the task is modified and marked as completed, then we're actually taking the file from the Modern Organic site and removing it to CRM. But you might notice these are all SharePoint actions, as you can tell from these lovely indicators. That's part of the advantage of having Dynamics 365 in this case. Dynamics 365, when you have an opportunity, is configured to right now create also a relating group site for that opportunity. So to move it into CRM, since Dynamics 365 is actually already using Office 365 groups to hold that data, all we have to do is move the final copy over to the relevant section, and it's available. To show you quickly, here's the avocado skin cream private group. This was created with the opportunity. Now, when the task was marked as complete, the file was copied, actually a new version created, and the content copied over to the avocado skin cream group. And that reflects here in the opportunity in CRM. We go and take a look in CRM at our documents. We see that file sitting there, connected and available through CRM, but actually residing in the SharePoint site. Great, so we've gone through sales, we've gone through pre-sales back to sales. At this point, sales just has to seal the deal, right? Well, luckily here they've already done that. Let's take a quick look at what the new process is. So, sales has a proposal. They can take that to the client whenever they want. They don't have to go and make sure that they have the right version or any of that. It's already showed up and the status has been updated. So the sales associate can mark it, the opportunity as closed and won when they get approval from the prospective client or from the account. That action will trigger yet another flow, the final flow. And this flow is the one that's going to give that final notification to the pre-sales team. In fact, we wanted to update the metadata if possible. And it's also going to create the Project Online site. We're going to take that entire burden off of the project manager. He doesn't need to be a Project Online admin. We just want him to do the project management. So Flow is going to take over that role for him. And really, that's just going to let him jump in and do his job. So we can go that much quicker from acquisition to implementation or fulfillment. Take a quick look at that flow. So here we go. So here again, we see a dynamic CRM action. When the opportunity is closed, and closed because it's won, then we're going to go ahead and run through a Project Online action. So our trigger from CRM lets us create a new Project Online site. And here we just specify the data that we want to send into it. And it's that simple. So all of a sudden, all of this back and forth has been simplified, and people are just doing their jobs. Everything before that they were doing that was just a hassle and paperwork is now being taken care of by Flow. So Flow is really a fantastic solution. If you're familiar with the internet, this type of concept has been around for a while with something like if, this, and that and whatnot. But Microsoft is taking it, deeply integrating it into SharePoint, on-prem, off-prem, as well as their other offerings like Power Apps, taking new features such as Common Data Service, and rolling all that up into an application that is also able to leverage a plethora of other services. And if we go through the connectors, you'll see there's over 100 already, and there's a lot more than that actually, and it keeps growing because it's easy to implement and easy to use. Now, licensing. So Flow is what I call freemium. Depending on the SKU you have for Office 365, you'll have either Flow Free, Flow Plan 1, Flow Plan 2. Now, the differences are essentially the number of times it can run in a month. And you want to be careful with this because if you trigger off to something as common as like a new email or uploaded file, even if that first condition is a negative and nothing else happens, that counts as a run for the flow. But you're also limited by time. If you're using the free version for your SKU, it's only checking every 15 minutes to see if that trigger has occurred. Whereas when you go into Flow Plan 1 and 2, that gets reduced down to 3 minutes and 1 minute. As you can see, though, across the board, you can create as many as you want. You're just limited by how many times they run, and if you need to, you can always purchase more runs. So here's just a little bit more information. So what includes Dynamics 365 for Flow? You see all these different versions have an iteration of Flow, and of course, as you go into the higher SKUs, you'll get the better plans, and then you have the same thing here for Office 365. So education, business essentials, they still have access to Flow. Great, so we have a tool now that can take tons of applications. Take the data from one, throw it to another. It could be enabled and used by any power user. What could go wrong, right? Quite a bit. Okay, there has to be some control. Luckily, there is. Microsoft thought of that. Potential issues that could occur are, okay, a user creates an infinite loop. What if we have a user create an opportunity in CRM that creates a document in SharePoint that then creates another opportunity in CRM? We have an infinite loop occurring, and that can just bog down the entire tenant. There are throttling mechanisms in place to lessen and stop the impact of such an event. What about managing the flows overall? What if a flow is created, but we don't want it to be running on our environment? There is central management over your flows by the tenant administrator. As we see here in the screenshot, you can turn them off, on, delete, view. You have ability to centrally manage these flows. In addition, you can see here by this environment, I don't go into too much, but you can define different environments such as development and QA for these flows to exist in and run on. So you don't have to modify production even though you are in an Office 365 tenant. All right, great, but what about data? Well, data is always a concern, right? What's stopping a user from taking information from our CRM system and having it so every time a new client is added, well, I'm going to go ahead and send a personal email so that he has a permanent retention of every client for the organization. You can restrict that. You define what applications for your tenant are business only, business data only, and you define where's the no-no zone. Where can that business data never go? If there's a flow that tries to use business data only with no business data, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. So it's giving you control over data, defining where your data-sensitive applications are, and then also restricting where those data-sensitive applications are allowed to send traffic to. So there's something I glossed over really quickly, but something I want to make note of as well. So you have two things here, my flows and team flows, and templates, but I'll talk about that in a second. Now, my flows are flows that I create. I have access to them. I'm an owner. I turn them on or off. Connections are made with accounts that I have, but oftentimes there's going to be the need to have more than one person on a workflow. We don't want a flow to disappear because John Smith leaves the organization and he's the one that created it. Well, that's why we have team flows, and that was actually introduced earlier this year. So team flows are just what it sounds like. They are the team-owned, enterprise-owned workflows. So you can define who's an owner, you define who's the owner on the connection, who's the identity that's being used in this connection. And should John Adams leave, the workflow doesn't go with me because it's got multiple owners and it's part of the organization. So that's the difference between my flows and team flows. And another great feature of flows is templates. You don't have to make everything yourself. You can take what's been done before and build on it. A lot of great templates are out there. You can make your own templates and share those. But when you create a flow, you're not starting from scratch every time. Instead, you have the ability to build off of what others have done before you. So let's take a quick look back at what we have with Flow. So Flow, it's a fantastic tool to glue multiple applications together, to send data from one to the other, to simplify it, centrally administer it, reduce impact on the individual applications, reduce the need for overhead and change control, but it does not replace those workflows that are resident in the individual applications like Dynamics workflow, SharePoint Designer workflow, and what have you. And that's very important to remember. A great way to view this is that Microsoft Flow is not, what would be the instant solution to all our needs, which is like an instant teleporter of information. What it is, though, is Microsoft Flow is a brand new interstate highway connecting application A and application B. Previously, we would have had to use county roads and back roads to get from A to B, just trying to almost hack our way into sharing information between these two systems. But Flow provides a direct course of traffic from one to the other in a regulated and safe manner. If we took a look at something that was done a few years ago, if we wanted to get information from CRM Online and send it to SharePoint Online, even just 3 years ago, we would have been looking at custom code deployment. Then we have to worry about the infrastructure running that, connectivity, security. None of that. Flow takes care of all that for us. And so it gives us the pathway to quick and instantly bridge all these multiple web applications and secure services together without sacrificing anything in each of them in terms of functionality and overall ability. So I'd like to thank you for your time. That's my presentation for today. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Danny and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, John. We have had one question come through during your presentation, and that is, how can we control the app availability with a basic plan? So is there a DLP policy that we can apply for the basic plan?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's the business data that can be applied, but there is also a separate DLP. Now, I need to I have to dig into exactly how that's applied, but in addition to the business data policy, there is a data loss prevention that can be applied to your flows.
Thank you, John. It looks like the next question is, does Flow depend on Power Apps or vice versa? I always see them marketed together.
No, and that's actually very easy to get confused. So Power Apps is the new form solution, the quick and easy web-based or device-agnostic way to make an application oriented towards mobile. It's being brought into SharePoint for Forms. But it utilizes Flow heavily, but it does not need Flow. Vice versa, Flow could use Power Apps and is often using Power Apps as a front end for what it does, but it does not need Power Apps. So they are marketed together because they're like peanut butter and jelly. They work very well together, taste great, but you can have either by itself and still enjoy it.
Thank you, John. The next question is there a list of all of the applications available to be connected? Can we create our own custom connections?
You can create your own premium connection. I believe that's available in Flow Plan 1 and 2. I haven't done that myself, but I know there is extensibility there. You can just go to flow.microsoft.com. You go to services, and you can take a look at the services that are available, the templates that are available, and in general, just play around.
Thank you, John. The next question is it possible to access REST Web Services API from this platform using OAuth2 or Open Connection to authenticate the API?
That's an interesting question. So Flow is oriented more towards the user than the developer. They do utilize integration like with a common data service and Azure Bus, but executing a web service directly, I do not believe so. That's kind of the simplicity that it's trying to make, is it's trying to get away from having to do that call by itself and instead rely on integrated services to the information. I'm not saying it can't be done, I'm just not sure the method you would need to do to implement it. And that might be something where instead of looking at Flow, you might want to look at Logic Apps in Azure, which is similar to Flow, but much more developer-oriented in terms of workflow solution. They both have their place, though.
John, in regards to that comment, they did ask what tool in Azure.
It's called Logic Apps. So it's essentially Flow for developers, giving you the more powerful scripting commands and whatnot based in the Azure environment. It takes a lot of the interface from Flow. I haven't played with it too much, but I do know if you're looking to do something like calling that web off, look for Logic Apps within Azure, and that's a solution that should meet your needs.
Okay, thank you, John. I was going to say we'll give everyone a few more minutes to get questions in, but we have had another come through, which is, what safeguards are there against users creating flows that are harmful, like infinite loops?
So the infinite loops, they have baked into it, into Flow, they do have throttling. They see something churning around over and over, Flow is going to take care of that, similar to the way that throttling can occur for any Office 365 type of implementation. So they do have built-in safeguards against that type of unintentionally malicious behavior.
Thank you, John. Now, going back to the first question we had come through regarding how can we control the app availability with the basic plan, they did mention that that is only for Plan 2, not for the basic plan. I didn't know if there was any more you could expand on that.
I'm not a licensing expert with Flow, unfortunately. Let's go. So the licensing site, I can go ahead and make sure it gets sent out with the survey, but it goes into the details with the plan comparison, what plan has what capabilities, and I can talk and put you in touch with someone from our sales team who is much more in tune with the licensing. Since Flow is new, I don't have as good a handle on it as I do with other SKUs from the Office 365 system in terms of licensing.
Thanks, John. The next question we have is, can we pause the flow? How long can flows run, and can we kill it?
You can definitely kill it. Let me actually go over and show that. That's a cool part of the interface I did not demonstrate, but if we go in and take a look at, for example, this flow, I'm going to close out of the edit flow mode, and what you'll see if I just go in and click into it, it'll not only tell us the connections and the owners, but it'll tell us the run history. So if something is executing, we can resubmit it, see what's going on with it. I don't have anything in process, but I believe you can pause it as well. Something very cool here, though, during flow execution, unlike SharePoint Designer, it actually tells you step-by-step the execution time, the success and fail, the expression results, and just gives you a lot of insight for a simple workflow. It tells you all the value, the input values, and the output values that are being sent. So, unfortunately, I can't demonstrate the pause. I believe so, but like I said, I don't have a flow that's run long enough to try and demonstrate that. But you have a lot of control in terms of at least analysis. I know I'm missing part of the question. It was, how long can it run for? I need to check on that. I need to see what the control is and what the current limit thresholds are set for a flow.
Okay, thank you, John. The next question is, why doesn't Microsoft want SharePoint Designer workflow? Why Flow in Office 365?
Well, the answer is because SharePoint Designer workflow is meant for what it does best, which is SharePoint, and Project Online because it works off of SharePoint. So Flow is looking to instead bridge that gap. So you don't want to rely on SharePoint to suddenly connect data from CRM to MailChimp or Google Mail. You want something independent to bridge that gap because SharePoint would be an unnecessary go-between. Not only that, but the way SharePoint Designer workflows are built right now, you're relying on the web services and APIs instead of something that's already been integrated where you can just plug and play.
Thank you, John. The next question is, what is the difference between Microsoft Flow and Azure Logic apps?
So that's kind of where I was getting at with the previous question. So Flow is user-oriented, okay? It has a ton of power. Most of the time it's what you need, but if you do need to go and take that extra step, the Logic apps is oriented at your developers, at being able to implement these types of external workflows in a much more complex manner through Azure. So it is a separate app, but you'll see with Logic apps, the interface is very similar, just a lot more powerful. In fact, if we take a look at this workflow right here, when we take a look at this condition, this is using that Azure workflow logic. So this is actually sharing some of that advanced capability with Logic apps, but it's designed to be simple for users. That doesn't mean it's less powerful. It's just what it's oriented for in its design.
Okay, the next question we've had come through is it version 1 of Flow? How does the future look like?
Well, Flow is huge. So it is still version 1, or depending on how you view it, maybe it shouldn't be 1 yet, but the future is bright, okay? Power Apps is here to stay. Flow is deeply integrated with that. The library of connections for Flow is doing nothing but grow. Flow is integrated into SharePoint 2016 as well as SharePoint Online. So Flow is integrated, not sure if that was Feature Pack 1 or if it was coming in Feature Pack 2, but Flow is part of Office 2016. I mean SharePoint 2016. It's not going anywhere. They're integrating it into their core solutions.
Okay, the next question we've had come through is, I see the long list of connectors in the Flow editor. Who builds those, and what would it take to get one added for a product that isn't listed?
I would honestly need to look into that and see what the steps are for creating and publishing flows. If it's anything like their bots or tabs for teams, it's probably meeting certain criteria and going through a submission and review process. I'm sure if we went to something like dev.microsoft.com or maybe even in the footer, we would be able to get more insight into that. So I would need to do some follow-up and touch base with you.
Okay, thank you, John. It looks like that is all the questions we have for now, so this will conclude today's webinar. A recording of this will be sent to all participants. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please email info@microexcel.com. Thank you and have a wonderful day.